When Sarah's grandfather passed away on a cold November evening, the entire family gathered at his estate for the reading of the will. The mansion that had been built by her great-grandfather stood tall and imposing, filled with memories of childhood summers and family celebrations. Sara sat quietly in the corner of the grand library, watching as her relatives whispered among themselves, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. She'd always been the quiet one, the girl who preferred books to parties, studies to social gatherings. And her grandfather had been her closest companion in a family that never quite understood her. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, a portly man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat and began reading the will in his monotonous voice. Uncle James received the textile business that had been the foundation of the family's wealth for 3 generations. Aunt Margaret was given the 2 beach properties in Miami and the apartment building in downtown Manhattan. Cousin Richard inherited the investment portfolio worth millions, while his sister Diana received the jewelry collection and the vintage car collection. One by one, each family member's name was called, and substantial assets were distributed, their faces lighting up with satisfaction and greed when Mr. Harrison finally reached Sarah's name. The room fell silent and all eyes turned to her. She felt her heart pounding as she waited to hear what her beloved grandfather had left for her. The lawyer paused, adjusted his glasses, and said in a careful tone that Sara Mitchell was to receive her grandfather's personal diary, a leather-bound journal that he had kept for the last 15 years of his life. The silence was immediately broken by poorly concealed snickers and whispered comments about how the old man must have finally lost his mind in his final days. Sara felt the heat of embarrassment wash over her face as Aunt Margaret loudly proclaimed that it was such a shame that poor Sara got nothing of real value. Uncle James patted her shoulder condescendingly and said she could always come work as a secretary in the family business if she needed money. Cousin Diana couldn't even hide her smirk as she examined her new diamond necklace in the light. Sara took the diary from Mr. Harrison's outstretched hand, feeling the weight of the worn leather, and quietly excused herself from the room while her family continued to celebrate their newfound wealth. That night, alone in her small apartment across town, Sara sat on her bed and opened the diary with trembling hands. The first page bore her grandfather's distinctive handwriting, elegant and precise despite his age. To my dearest Sara, he had written, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have witnessed the true nature of our family. This diary contains everything you need to know about the empire I built and how it was stolen from under me. Use this knowledge wisely, my brilliant girl. And remember that revenge is a dish best served with justice. Sara's breath caught in her throat as she turned the pages and began to understand what her grandfather had given her. Each entry was meticulously dated and detailed, containing information about business transactions, property deals, personal conversations, and most damning of all, evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and betrayal. Her grandfather had known exactly what his children and grandchildren were doing behind his back, and he had documented every single instance with the precision of a man who had spent his life building a business empire from nothing. The entries began 3 years earlier, shortly after her grandfather had suffered his first stroke. He wrote about how Uncle James had come to visit him in the hospital, expressing concern and love, while simultaneously forging signatures on documents that transferred company funds to offshore accounts. The diary contained photocopies of the original documents and the forged ones, bank statements, and even recorded conversations that her grandfather had secretly made. Sara realized her grandfather had been far more aware and capable than anyone had given him credit for during his illness. As she continued reading through the night, Sara discovered the extent of Aunt Margaret's deception. Her aunt had convinced grandfather to sign over 2 valuable properties, claiming she wanted to create a trust fund for her daughter's education. The diary showed that within 3 weeks of receiving the properties, Margaret had sold them to a development company for 3 times their assessed value. The money had gone directly into her personal account, and she had spent it on luxury vacations, designer clothing, and a new Mercedes. Grandfather had found out 6 months before his death, when he accidentally saw the property sale announcement in the newspaper. The cousins' betrayal was perhaps the most audacious. Richard and Diana had created fake loan applications using the commercial properties as collateral, forging their grandfather's signature and falsifying financial documents. They had successfully obtained loans totaling $5 million from 3 different banks. The money had been used to fund Richard's failed tech startup and Diana's attempt to break into the film industry as a producer. Both ventures had collapsed, leaving massive debts secured against properties that weren't theirs to leverage. Grandfather had discovered this only a month before his death when bank notices began arriving at the estate, but the most shocking revelation came in the diary's final entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand as grandfather's health declined. He had made a new will, one that would divide all assets equally among all grandchildren, with Sara named as executor because she was the only one he trusted. He had given this will to his longtime lawyer, Thomas Patterson, with strict instructions that it be opened only in the presence of all family members. Yet the will that had been read today was different, dated a week after grandfather's death, and it gave everything to the older generation while leaving Sara with only the diary. Sara sat back against her, head bored as dawn light began filtering through her curtains, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. Her grandfather hadn't abandoned her or forgotten her in his final days. He had given her the most powerful inheritance of all, the truth, meticulously documented and impossible to refute. He had turned her into a weapon of justice, armed with knowledge that could destroy every single person who had betrayed him. The question was what she would do with this power. For the next week, Sara called in sick to her job at the small law firm where she worked as a junior associate. She spent every waking hour studying the diary, cross-referencing information, making copies of crucial pages, and building a timeline of the fraud. She created detailed spreadsheets documenting every transaction, every forged signature, every stolen dollar. Her legal training, which her family had always dismissed as a waste of time since she wasn't working at a prestigious firm, now became her greatest asset as she prepared to dismantle their house of cards. Sara knew she couldn't simply march into a police station with a diary and expect immediate action. She needed corroborating evidence, official documents, and a legal strategy that would be airtight. She also needed to understand the full scope of what had happened to the real will. Her first move was to contact David Patterson, the son of her grandfather's longtime lawyer. Thomas Patterson had retired 2 years ago, and his son had taken over the practice. Sara made an appointment under the pretense of needing advice about a personal, legal matter. David Patterson's office was in a modest building downtown, far from the glass towers where the corporate lawyers worked. He was a man in his early 40s with kind eyes and an honest face that reminded Sara of his father. When she entered his office, she carried the diary in her bag and a strategy in her mind. She began by asking general questions about estate law and wills, watching his reactions carefully. David was patient and thorough in his explanations, and Sara sensed that he was a man who valued integrity over profit. After 20 minutes of preliminary discussion, Sara placed the diary on David's desk and asked him directly if his father had received a will from her grandfather 2 weeks before his death. David's expression changed immediately, shifting from professional courtesy to genuine concern. He asked her to wait and disappeared into a back room that housed his father's archived files. Sara sat in the quiet office, her heart pounding, knowing that this moment would determine whether her quest for justice would succeed or fail. When David returned 30 minutes later, he was carrying a sealed envelope marked with her grandfather's name and a date that matched the diary entry exactly. His hands were shaking slightly as he placed it on the desk between them. He explained that his father had been meticulous about following client instructions, and this envelope had been marked specifically to be opened only in the presence of all named beneficiaries. It had never been opened because the family had presented a different will, supposedly more recent and in the chaos following the funeral. This envelope had been overlooked and eventually archived. Sara felt a surge of vindication, mixed with rage as she realized what had happened. Someone in her family had known about the real will and had deliberately suppressed it, substituting a fake one instead. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just fraud and embezzlement, it was inheritance theft on a massive scale. David Patterson's face had gone pale as he began to understand what Sara was suggesting.
He said that if what she was implying was true, this was one of the most serious cases of will fraud he had ever encountered in his career. Together, they carefully opened the envelope, documenting the process with photographs and David's written observations to ensure the chain of evidence would hold up in court. The will inside was exactly as grandfather had described in his diary. All assets were to be divided equally among all grandchildren, with specific provisions for the family business to be professionally managed by a board that included Sara as chairperson. The signature was clear and firm, obviously made when grandfather still had good motor control. Unlike the shaky signature on the will that had been probate, David immediately recognized the severity of the situation and offered to help Sara pro bono if necessary. He had loved his father and respected the relationship between Thomas Patterson and Sara's grandfather, and he was horrified that someone had deliberately circumvented his father's client's wishes. Sara accepted his help gratefully, knowing she would need an experienced attorney to navigate the legal complexities ahead. Together, they began planning their strategy, deciding to gather all possible evidence. Before making any accusations that would alert the family to what was coming, Sara's next step was to hire a forensic accountant. She contacted Maya Chen, a woman she had met at a legal conference who specialized in uncovering financial fraud. Maya had a reputation for being brilliant, thorough, and absolutely relentless when she was on a case. Sara explained the situation in general terms during their first meeting, holding back the most damning details until she was certain Maya would take the case. Maya's eyes lit up with professional interest as Sara described the offshore accounts and shell companies mentioned in the diary. Over the next month, Maya worked her magic through the financial records. She traced every dollar that Uncle James had moved through his network of shell companies, documenting how he had systematically siphoned money from the family textile business over a 3-year period. The total amount was staggering. Over $3 million had been stolen, hidden in accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore. Mayo's report showed the paper trail with such clarity that even a financial novice could follow the money from the legitimate business accounts to James's personal enrichment. While Maya worked on the financial fraud, Sara focused on gathering evidence about the property sales. She spent days at the county recorder's office, pulling every document related to the properties that Aunt Margaret had received and subsequently sold. She discovered that Margaret had indeed claimed the properties were for her daughter's benefit when she received them, but the sale documents showed Margaret as the sole seller and the sole recipient of the proceeds. Sara also found the original property valuations, which showed that Margaret had undersold the properties to a developer who happened to be her tennis partner's husband, suggesting a kickback arrangement. The loan fraud committed by Richard and Diana required a different approach. Sara carefully reviewed the diary's photocopies of the loan applications and compared them to legitimate documents bearing her grandfather's signature from the same time period. The differences were obvious to her legally trained eye. The signatures on the loan documents were too perfect, too steady, clearly traced from an older document. She contacted a handwriting expert, Dr. Elizabeth Morris, who had testified in numerous fraud cases. Dr. Morris examined the documents and confirmed that the signatures were indeed forgeries, created by tracing and then slightly modifying an authentic signature. As the evidence mounted, Sara found herself transforming from a quiet, bookish young woman into a focused and determined warrior for justice. She stopped attending family gatherings, making excuses about work and personal obligations. Her absence was barely noticed by her relatives, who were too busy enjoying their newfound wealth to care about the family member they had always dismissed. Uncle James had expanded the business aggressively, making risky decisions now that he thought he was in complete control. Aunt Margaret had bought another property in the Hamptons and was planning an extended European vacation. The cousins were living large, throwing parties and posting their extravagant lifestyle on social media, but Sara was watching everything, documenting every expenditure, every ostentatious display of wealth that had been stolen from her grandfather's legacy. She created social media accounts under fake names to monitor her cousins' posts, saving screenshots of their expensive purchases and luxury vacations. Every post was another piece of evidence showing that they were spending far beyond what their legitimate incomes could support. Evidence that would demonstrate they had acquired sudden wealth right after her grandfather's death, 3 months after the funeral. Sara had assembled a case file that was nearly 6 inches thick. She had the original will, forensic accounting reports, handwriting analysis, property records, bank statements, and the diary itself with all its meticulous documentation. David Patterson had worked with her to prepare a comprehensive legal complaint that would challenge the probated will, expose the fraud, and seek both civil and criminal penalties against the perpetrators. They decided it was time to file the lawsuit the day Sara filed the complaint in probate court. She felt a mixture of nervousness and exhilaration. She knew that once this legal action became public, her family would turn against her with everything they had. She would be called ungrateful, vindictive, greedy, and crazy. They would try to paint her as a bitter young woman who couldn't accept her grandfather's final wishes. But Sara was ready for their attacks because she had the one thing they didn't, the absolute truth. Documented beyond any reasonable doubt, the family's reaction was even more explosive than Sara had anticipated. Uncle James called her within hours of being served with the lawsuit, his voice shaking with rage as he accused her of betraying the family and spitting on their father's grave. He threatened to destroy her career, to make sure she never worked in law again, to sue her for defamation. Sara listened calmly to his tirade and then simply said that he should save his energy for talking to his criminal defense attorney because he was going to need one. The line went dead as James slammed down the phone. Aunt Margaret's response was more calculated and vicious. She called a family meeting, deliberately excluding Sara, where she painted her niece as mentally unstable and suffering from delusions brought on by grief. Margaret suggested that Sara had fabricated evidence out of jealousy and bitterness, and she convinced several family members to sign a statement attesting to Sara's supposed mental health issues. It was a clever strategy, attempting to undermine Sara's credibility before the case even went to trial. But Margaret didn't know about the recordings, the forensic evidence, and the original will that Sara had secured. Richard and Diana took a different approach, reaching out to Sara with messages that alternated between pleading and threatening. Diana sent tearful texts claiming she had no idea what Sara was talking about, that there must be some terrible misunderstanding, and couldn't they work this out as family? Richard's messages were more blunt, warning Sara that she was making powerful enemies and that she should drop the lawsuit before things got ugly. Sara saved every message, every email, every voicemail, adding them to her evidence file as examples of attempted intimidation. The preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks after the filing, giving both sides time to prepare their arguments. Sara's legal team, now expanded to include a senior litigator that David had brought in, prepared methodically for every possible defense strategy. They anticipated that the family would argue the diary was fake, that the will they had probated was legitimate, and that Sara was motivated by greed rather than justice. For each argument, they prepared overwhelming counter evidence that would be impossible to refute. During those 6 weeks, Sara experienced the full force of her family's retaliation. Someone leaked to the press that she was suing her family, and reporters began calling her constantly, trying to get comments about the family feud over inheritance. Anonymous social media accounts appeared, posting vicious attacks on her character and spreading rumors about her personal life. Someone vandalized her car, scratching "greedy bitch" into the paint. Sara filed police reports for everything but refused to be intimidated or distracted from her mission. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived, and Sara walked into the courthouse flanked by David Patterson and their senior litigator, Marcus Williams. Marcus was a 60-year-old African-American, attorney with a reputation for taking down corporate criminals and corrupt officials. He had reviewed Sarah's evidence and told her it was one of the strongest fraud cases he had ever seen. As they entered the courtroom, Sara saw her entire family assembled on the opposite side, Uncle James with his expensive lawyers, Aunt Margaret looking imperious in designer clothes, and the cousins trying to appear innocent and wronged. Judge Patricia Morrison presided over the hearing, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach and intolerance for dishonesty. Sara had researched every judge in the probate division and felt fortunate that Judge Morrison had been assigned to the case.
As the hearing began, the family's attorneys immediately moved to dismiss the case, arguing that Sara had missed the deadline for contesting the will and that her claims were baseless and motivated by spite. Marcus Williams rose to respond, and Sara watched as he systematically dismantled every argument with citations of law and preliminary evidence. When Marcus presented the sealed original will from Ajtem, Thomas Patterson's files, the courtroom atmosphere changed dramatically. The family's lawyers conferred urgently in whispered conversations, clearly not having expected this development. Judge Morrison examined the envelope and its contents carefully, noting the date and the specific instructions that had been violated. She asked the family's attorneys directly how they explained the existence of two wills with different dates and completely different distributions. The lawyers stumbled through explanations about the testator's right to change his mind, but their arguments rang hollow. Marcus then introduced preliminary findings from the forensic accountant, presenting a summary of the offshore accounts and the money trail leading from the family business to Uncle James's personal enrichment. He showed the court records of the property sales and the timing that suggested fraud. He presented the handwriting expert's preliminary opinion that the signatures on the loan documents were forgeries. With each piece of evidence, the judge's expression grew more serious, and the family's legal team looked increasingly desperate. Judge Morrison made her ruling before the lunch recess, denying the motion to dismiss and instead ordering a full evidentiary hearing to be scheduled within 60 days. She also issued a temporary restraining order freezing all assets from the estate until the matter could be fully adjudicated, preventing the family from dissipating or hiding assets. The family was visibly shocked by this development. Uncle James stood up and shouted that this was an outrage, that his business would be destroyed until Judge Morrison threatened him with contempt of court. Sara sat quietly through it all, maintaining her composure despite the chaos around her. As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed them with questions. Marcus gave a brief statement saying they were confident that justice would be served and that the evidence would speak for itself. Sara said nothing, keeping her head high as cameras flashed and microphones were thrust in her face. Behind her, she could hear Aunt Margaret loudly proclaiming that Sara would be exposed as a liar and a fraud. Sara didn't turn around or respond. She had learned that dignified silence was more powerful than any angry retort. The next 60 days were a whirlwind of depositions, document requests, and legal maneuvering. Sara was deposed by the family's attorneys for 3 full days, during which they tried every tactic to shake her story or catch her in inconsistencies. She remained calm and precise, referring to the diary and supporting documents when answering questions. Her legal training served her well. She knew how to answer only what was asked, how to avoid speculation, and how to maintain credibility under hostile questioning. The depositions of the family members were far more dramatic. Uncle James became belligerent when confronted with the evidence of offshore accounts, first denying their existence and then claiming they were legitimate business holdings. When Maya Chun's detailed forensic report was presented, showing exactly how the money had been moved and hidden, James's story changed to claim he had been protecting family assets from creditors. His explanations were contradictory and implausible, and his own lawyers looked uncomfortable as he testified. Aunt Margaret's deposition revealed a woman who felt entitled to take whatever she wanted from the family estate. She argued that her father had wanted her to have those properties, and what she did with them afterward was nobody's business. When confronted with evidence that she had sold the properties at below market value to a friend's company and likely received kickbacks, she became defensive and hostile. Her testimony about the properties being for her daughter's benefit was directly contradicted by bank records showing all the money went to her personal account and was spent on luxury. Items. Richard and Diana's depositions were painful to watch. They were younger and less experienced at deception than their parents' generation, and they crumbled under questioning. Diana broke down crying, admitting they had forged the signatures but claiming they had been desperate and planned to pay the money back. Richard tried to maintain his innocence longer, but when presented with the handwriting analysis and his own social media posts showing him bragging about his new wealth, he too finally admitted to the forgery. Both claimed they had been led astray by their parents' examples of taking from grandfather. As the evidence mounted and depositions were completed, Sara could see the family's defense collapsing. Their attorneys began making overtures about settlement, suggesting that perhaps an arrangement could be reached that would avoid the publicity and expense of a full trial. Marcus Williams brought these offers to Sara, explaining that she could potentially get a substantial settlement, restore the original will's distributions, and avoid months of additional litigation. It was a tempting offer. She could declare victory and move on with her life, but Sara remembered her grandfather's words in the diary about justice, not just revenge. A quiet settlement would give her money, but it wouldn't hold anyone accountable for their crimes. Uncle James would still control the business he had stolen from. Aunt Margaret would keep most of her ill-gotten gains. The cousins would face no real consequences for their fraud. Sara told Marcus that she wanted to proceed to trial, that she wanted a public accounting of what had been done, and that she wanted criminal referrals for those who had committed crimes. Marcus smiled at her determination and said he had been hoping she would say that. The trial began on a Monday morning in late spring, almost 7 months after her grandfather's death. The courtroom was packed with family members, reporters, and curious observers who had been following the case in the media. Sara had become something of a local celebrity, the young woman taking on her wealthy family for justice. Some people painted her as a hero fighting corruption. Others saw her as a vindictive troublemaker destroying her family. Sara tried to ignore both characterizations and focus on the facts. Marcus Williams opened with a powerful statement that laid out the entire case in clear, compelling terms. He described Sara's grandfather as a self-made man who had built a business empire through hard work and integrity, only to be betrayed by the very family he had worked to enrich. He explained how the betrayal had begun during grandfather's illness, when he was most vulnerable, and how it had culminated in the suppression of his true will and the theft of his legacy. Marcus promised the jury that the evidence would show a pattern of fraud, forgery, barishry, and greed that was both shocking and undeniable. The family's attorney, a silver-haired man named Douglas Thornton who specialized in defending white-collar criminals, offered a very different narrative. He portrayed Sara's grandfather as an elderly man whose mental capacity had declined in his final years, making him susceptible to paranoid delusions and conspiracy theories. He suggested that the diary was the product of a confused mind, that the family members had acted in good faith to manage the estate according to grandfather's true wishes, and that Sara was exploiting her grandfather's mental decline to pursue a baseless case motivated by greed and resentment. The first witness was David Patterson, who testified about receiving the sealed will from Sara's grandfather. He explained his father's meticulous practices and the specific instructions that had accompanied the will. Under cross-examination, Thornton tried to suggest that the will had been created under duress or when grandfather lacked capacity. But David calmly explained that his father had met with grandfather multiple times and had been satisfied that he was fully competent and acting of his own free will. David also testified that grandfather had specifically mentioned being worried about his family's intentions. Dr. Elizabeth Morris, the handwriting expert, was the next witness. She presented a detailed analysis of the signatures on various documents, using enlarged photographs projected on screens for the jury to see. She showed how the signatures on the loan documents were too perfect, too uniform, lacking the natural variation that occurs in authentic signatures. She demonstrated how the signatures had been traced from older documents, pointing out specific characteristics that proved they were forgeries. Under cross-examination, Thornton tried to challenge her methodology, but Dr. Morris had testified in hundreds of cases and easily defended her analysis. Maya Chun's testimony took an entire day and was perhaps the most damaging to the family's case. She walked the jury through the complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fraudulent transfers that Uncle James had created. She presented bank statements, wire transfer records, and corporate filings that showed exactly how $3 million had been systematically stolen from the family business. Her presentation was so clear and methodical that even people with no financial background could follow the money trail and understand the fraud. Throughout Maya's testimony, Uncle James sat rigid in his seat, his face growing redder as the extent of his theft was laid bare for everyone to see. His attorneys tried to argue that these were legitimate business transactions, but Maya had anticipated every defense and had documents that refuted each claim. She showed that the shell companies had no real business purpose, that they existed only to hide stolen money, and that James had personally benefited from every fraudulent transaction. The jury members took extensive notes, and several looked at Uncle James with obvious disgust. The property fraud involving Aunt Margaret was addressed through testimony from real estate experts and county records officials. They established the timeline of the property transfers, the suspicious sales to connected parties at below market values, and the immediate disappearance of the proceeds into Margaret's personal accounts. A particularly devastating witness was the real estate agent who had handled the sales, who testified that Margaret had specifically instructed her to expedite the sales, and had laughed about how easy it was to get the properties from her senile old father. Sara herself took the stand on the fourth day of trial. Marcus led her through her relationship with her grandfather, establishing how close they had been and how he had confided in her about his concerns regarding the family. She testified about receiving the diary, reading it for the first time, and gradually understanding the scope of what had been done. She remained composed even when Thornton aggressively cross-examined her, trying to suggest she had fabricated evidence or was motivated by jealousy of her more successful relatives. Thornton's cross-examination of Sara was brutal. He spent hours trying to catch her in inconsistencies, suggesting she had forged pages of the diary herself, implying she was mentally unstable, and painting her as a bitter woman who couldn't accept her grandfather's true wishes. But Sara had prepared thoroughly for this moment. She answered each question calmly and precisely, referring to specific diary entries and corroborating evidence. When Thornton tried to rattle her by suggesting her grandfather had never really loved her and had left her the diary as a cruel joke, Sara looked him directly in the eye and said that her grandfather had left her the diary because he knew she was the only one with the courage to seek justice. The most emotional testimony came from former employees of the family business who had worked with Sara's grandfather for decades. They testified about his character, his business practices, and his mental sharpness even in his final months. One elderly woman who had been grandfather's secretary for 30 years broke down crying as she described how he had confided in her about his suspicions regarding James's theft. She testified that grandfather had been heartbroken by his family's betrayal but determined to document everything so the truth would eventually come out. Several of these employees also testified about changes in the business after Uncle James took control. They described how James had fired longtime workers who questioned his decisions, how he had abandoned the ethical practices that grandfather had insisted upon, and how he had driven the company toward aggressive expansion that prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability. Their testimony painted a picture of a man who had not earned the business he inherited but had stolen it and was now destroying the legacy that his father had spent a lifetime building. The family put up their own witnesses, of course. They brought in doctors who had treated grandfather in his final years, trying to establish that his mental capacity had been diminished. But under cross-examination, each doctor admitted that while grandfather had physical limitations from his strokes, his mind had remained sharp and his decision-making capacity intact. They also called character witnesses who testified to Uncle James's business acumen and charitable works. But Marcus effectively undermined these witnesses by showing that James's charitable donations had only begun after he gained access to the stolen money. Aunt Margaret testified in her own defense, a decision her attorneys had clearly advised against but that she had insisted upon. She was poised and confident on direct examination, explaining that her father had wanted her to have the properties and that she had every right to sell them as she saw fit. But under Marcus's cross-examination, her composure cracked. He methodically went through the timeline, showing that she had lied to her father about her intentions, had sold the properties almost immediately, and had spent the money on luxury items rather than her daughters. Education, as she had claimed. Marcus produced Margaret's credit card statements, showing hundreds of thousands of dollars spent at luxury retailers, spas, and vacation resorts in the months following the property sales. He showed the court that her daughter's college funds had received not one penny of the property sale proceeds. He produced emails where Margaret had bragged to friends about manipulating her foolish old father into signing over valuable properties. By the time Marcus finished with her, Margaret's carefully constructed image of a devoted daughter had been completely shattered. Richard and Diana chose not to testify, on advice of their criminal defense attorneys who had been hired to represent them in the pending fraud charges. Their decision not to testify was damaging to the family's case, as it prevented them from offering any explanation for the forged loan documents. Marcus made sure the jury understood the significance of their silence, noting in his closing argument that innocent people don't refuse to testify when given the opportunity to tell their side of the story. The final piece of evidence was the diary itself. Marcus had saved it for last, wanting it to be fresh in the jurors' minds during deliberations. He read selected entries aloud in court, and Sara watched as the jury members' expressions changed from interest to shock to anger. These weren't dry legal documents or complex financial records. These were the words of an elderly man who had been betrayed by the people he loved most. Written in his own shaky handwriting as he struggled with failing health and a broken heart, one entry in particular seemed to affect everyone in the courtroom. It was written 2 months before grandfather's death, after he had discovered the loan fraud. He wrote, "I am an old man who built an empire from nothing and wanted to leave it to my family as a blessing. Instead, I have learned that my wealth has corrupted them, turned them into thieves and liars who see me only as an obstacle to overcome. My only consolation is Sara, who has never asked me for anything except my time and my stories. She alone has inherited my values along with my blood. I leave her the truth, documented in these pages, trusting that she will know what to do with it." When Marcus finished reading that entry, there wasn't a dry eye in the jury box. Even Judge Morrison had to pause to compose herself before instructing the attorneys to proceed. Sara felt tears running down her own cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She wanted everyone to see that this wasn't about money or revenge. It was about honoring a good man who had been betrayed and ensuring his true wishes were respected. The closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after the trial had begun. Douglas Thornton spoke first for the family's defense, making a last-ditch effort to convince the jury that this was all a misunderstanding. He argued that the family had acted in good faith based on the will they believed was valid, that any financial irregularities were the result of complex business transactions that Sara and her attorneys didn't understand, and that the diary was the product of an elderly man's confused mind. His argument was eloquent but hollow, unsupported by the evidence that had been presented. Marcus Williams rose for his closing argument and spoke for nearly 2 hours without notes. He walked the jury through the entire case, connecting all the pieces of evidence into a coherent narrative of betrayal and theft. He reminded them of Maya Chun's forensic accounting showing millions of dollars stolen by Uncle James. He recounted the property fraud committed by Aunt Margaret, documented by her own emails and spending records. He displayed the forged signatures created by Richard and Diana, analyzed by a handwriting expert whose credentials and methodology were unimpeachable. But Marcus also went beyond the technical evidence to speak about justice and accountability. He talked about the kind of man Sara's grandfather had been, building a business through hard work and integrity, only to watch his family abandon those values in pursuit of quick wealth. He spoke about Sara's courage in standing alone against her entire family, knowing she would be vilified and attacked, but doing it anyway because it was right. He ended by telling the jury that they had the power to restore justice, to honor a dead man's wishes, and to send a message that fraud and betrayal would not be rewarded. The jury deliberated for 3 days, and each day felt like an eternity to